And good day. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm Sean Patrick. This is the RMA Roadshow. We're doing our Livestock Roadshow session, and we're going to open up with this webinar that you're tuned into today. Thank you again for joining us. We've got people from across the country listening. This program is going to be oriented towards livestock producers today, and we're going to present the ins and outs of insurance programs, and we're also going to take some of your questions as well. And before we get underway here, RMA Administrator Marcia Bunger would like to welcome you all. Marcia.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be listening, tuning in from. My name is Marcia Bunger. I'm the RMA Administrator. In addition to that role, my husband and I also have a farming operation in southeastern South Dakota where we raise row crops of corn and beans, and we also have a 200 head cow-calf operation. Livestock producers are a very integral part of American agriculture, and RMA is improving and expanding insurance options to better meet your needs. We are attempting and working at ensuring all egg producers to have access to the strongest risk management tools as possible. And by achieving this goal, we have developed the Livestock Roadshow. It consists of workshops, both virtual and in person. And today you are attending one such of those workshops in person. I would encourage you to sit back, listen to our subject matter experts, take some notes, but of course, at any time, please feel free to enter into the chat, your questions, your comments. The feedback that we get is what's so very important in making any of our crop insurance livestock products as good as they can be. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Sean. And again, don't hesitate to put those questions in the chats. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcia. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started here. This is a Teams live event. This allows us to share one-way video and audio with the audience. So if you would like to turn on closed captions, you can do that. Just use the turn on live captions preview function. That's going to be on the event menu. And if you need to pause anytime, you can do that. The pause button's right there on the lower left corner of your screen. And you can click that button to play again from where you left off if you need to step aside for a minute or two. We're going to be recording this as well. This whole session is going to be recorded this afternoon, and you can access that after the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter today. His name is Cody McCann, a great guy from Missouri. He's been with RMA for 10 years. And he has an animal science degree from Missouri State University, and his family has a registered cattle herd. So Cody's going to cover livestock risk protection today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Cody McCann.
Thanks, Sean. Next slide, Cody. All right, so before we get started, I want to take a moment to cover how federal crop insurance is delivered. The federal crop insurance program works through a public-private partnership, whereas RMA sets all of the terms and conditions of the policies and then enters into reinsurance agreements with private companies known as approved insurance providers. Those insurance companies are who sell and service your policies through a network of insurance agents that they employ. Because the federal government is setting the policy terms, there's no need to shop around like you might do with other insurance for better terms or rates. They all will be the same no matter which company or agent you choose. Next slide. RMA offers a few options for livestock producers that we're going to cover today. We have a dairy revenue protection and LGM dairy for dairy producers, LGM and LRP for swine and fed cattle producers, LRP for feeder cattle, PRF and annual forage to insure your forage, and then we also have a new pilot program called Weaned Calf Risk Protection for cow-calf producers available in South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and Texas that I'm not going to cover today. More information about all of these policies can be found on our livestock page linked at the bottom of this slide. And if you're interested in learning more about weaned calf risk protection, we have a recorded presentation which should be available via a link below the one you clicked on to view this presentation. Next slide. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 played a pivotal role in our livestock insurance offerings. Prior to its passage, we were limited to a $20 million capacity limit for all livestock products per year. Removal of that capacity limit allowed for expansions and improvements to increase participation. Next slide. Some improvements to the livestock programs after its passage include increasing head limits from 2,000 to 25,000 head annually for LRP fed and feeder cattle, and from 32,000 head to 750,000 head for LRP swine. We were able to increase subsidy amount from 0 to up to 50% for LGM and from 13% to up to 55% for LRP. We also were able to expand programs to all 50 states and added coverage for unborn livestock for LRP. Next slide. So the first program that we're going to talk about today is Livestock Risk Protection, commonly referred to as LRP. It is probably the simplest program that RMA offers. You are just setting a price floor under your animals. LRP protects producers against a decline in market prices below a producer's selected coverage price. The crop year runs from July 1st to July 30th, and it uses CME futures and options prices to determine the offer. You should elect coverage to correspond to the time frame when you would normally market and sell your livestock. Unlike most crop insurance products, LRP can be purchased almost any day that the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is open. Sales start when we publish offers in the afternoon, and they run overnight and then end at 8:25 a.m. Central Time the next morning. As a word of advice, please don't wait until 8:24 in the morning to call your agent to try and bind coverage. LRP is purely a price risk product, so it does not cover death losses. But you must notify the insurance company within 72 hours of an animal death in order to maintain your coverage on that animal. Premium is due at the end of the endorsement period when you typically would have marketed your animals, and we offer coverage for unborn livestock on the feeder cattle and swine endorsements. You just have to have ownership of the mothers of the animals insured. You cannot market your insured livestock more than 60 days prior to the end of the endorsement, or you will end up owing premium and not being eligible for an indemnity. Next slide. Oops, next slide. Now let's focus on LRP feeder cattle for a few minutes. Like all LRP products, we have seen steady increases in participation over the recent years. As a note, for 2024, it may appear down, but the crop year does not end until June 30th. So their year is only about half over. Next slide. LRP feeder cattle is available for unborn calves, steers, heifers, Brahman, and dairy cattle, and 2 different weight ranges. Weight 1 is for calves that weigh 100 to 599 pounds when marketed, and weight 2 is for calves weighing 600 to 1,000 pounds. Unborn is only available for the lighter weight range. It is also worth noting that you cannot insure calves under LRP feeder cattle that are intended to be used as breeding stock. Subsidy ranges from 35 to 55% based on the coverage level you select, with the higher the coverage level selected, the lower the subsidy. Endorsements are available in a series of predefined lengths shown ranging from 13 to 52 weeks, but I'll give you a heads up that not all endorsement links are available every day. We do not always have all of the necessary data to publish offers for some of the longer endorsement lengths. You can buy coverage for up to 12,000 head in a day and up to 25,000 head in a crop year. Next slide. An indemnity is triggered if the actual ending value falls below the coverage price you elected. So the actual ending value is determined by the CME feeder cattle reported index. So your coverage is based upon the CME futures and options price, and the ending value uses the CME index, not the prices you actually receive on your livestock. We also have price adjustment factors shown here to modify the CME prices to recognize that different sizes and types of cattle have different values per pound. Next slide. Okay, let's walk through a quick example. You're a producer with 100 head of spring bred cows, and you're meeting with your insurance agent on February 15th. The cows are in the third period and expected to start calving on March 15th. So we already know we're looking at an unborn type. You expect to wean those calves on September 15th, and that date really doesn't matter. You expect to market them on November 15th, and it's 39 weeks between November 15th and February 15th, which happens to be one of the endorsement links we offer. Next slide. Things you need to think about before purchasing the endorsement are how many calves you expect from the 100 cows, because you don't want to be paying premium on things like lost pregnancies. The length of endorsement you need to cover the calves until they're marketed, and what will they weigh in November? And what happens if you sell those calves more than 60 days before the endorsement ends, which we already know results in you owing premium and not being eligible for a potential indemnity. Next slide. So what do? You purchase an endorsement in February for 85 head of unborn steers and heifers. You get a 39-week endorsement, which ends on November 15th, and your target weight is 580 pounds. And the expected price is $225.85 per hundredweight, but the coverage price, which is the price floor you're insuring, and really the important number, is $224.70 per hundredweight. Next slide. So when calculating the premium, you take the premium per hundredweight, which in this example is $6.12, multiplied by the target weight, which is 5.8 hundredweight, and multiply that by the number of head, which is 85, to get a premium bill of $3,018. Next slide. So after you bought the coverage, what happened? You ended up marketing 80 head of those calves on October 18th. Remember, you bought coverage for 85 head, but you had 90 calves born and 10 were lost in a snowstorm. And you did the right thing and notified the insurance company within 72 hours of their death in order to maintain coverage on those calves. You sold them at a local sale barn, and they averaged 560 pounds, which is fine because they were above the minimum weight for unborn steers and heifers, which in weight 1 is 100 pounds. You did market them before the end date, but it was within the 60-day window allowed, so there were no penalties there. Next slide. Like I previously stated, the actual ending value is calculated using the CME Feeder Cattle Reported Index, which in this case is for November 15 because that's when the endorsement ended. The reported index for November 15 is $228.76, with the price adjustment factor for unborn steers and heifers of $1.05 or 1.05, making the actual ending value $240.20 per hundredweight. Next slide. Here's just what the report looks like, with the highlighted line being the number we use. Next slide. So when determining if an indemnity is due, you look at the coverage price and the actual ending value. Since the actual ending value is more than the coverage price, no indemnity is due and you would need to pay the premium. Next slide. But let's assume that the actual ending value is $200.20 per hundredweight, which is less than the coverage price. Then an indemnity would be triggered. You would calculate the indemnity by taking the coverage price of 224.70 minus the value, the ending value of 220 to give you $24.50 per hundredweight per head. And you multiply that by the target weight of 5.8 hundredweight and 85 head insured to get an indemnity of $12,079. Then when your premium owed is subtracted from that amount, you end up with a net of $9,061. Next slide. Moving on to fed cattle, it's a similar story of recent increases in participation. Next slide. For fed cattle, it is available for cattle that are expected to grade select or higher with a yield grade of 1 through 3 with a slaughter weight of 1,000 to 1,600 pounds. The subsidy, endorsement links, and head limits are identical to those of feeder cattle. Next slide. Same story also that an indemnity is triggered if the actual ending value falls below the coverage price. And for fed cattle, the actual ending value is determined by the AMS 5-area weekly weighted average direct slaughter cattle report. And the line on the report that we will use is the live basis sales for steers over 80% choice, which is a recent change from the 35 to 65% choice series to recognize improvements in the genetics and feeding of cattle, resulting in higher quality grades. This new price series also has the added benefit of being based on a greater volume of data. Next slide. Finally, LRP swine, which shows the same trend line as cattle in recent years, just with much larger numbers of head. Next slide. Swine coverage is available for hogs expected to weigh from about 189 to 351 pounds on a hanging weight live basis. We do not offer coverage for feeder pigs. Same subsidy levels apply as cattle, and because swine have a shorter life cycle than cattle, the endorsement links available are a little bit different. For swine, or unborn swine, it is available for endorsement links of 30 plus weeks shown above, and for all of other swine, it is available for endorsement links shown that are 30 weeks or less. The head limits are 70,000 head per endorsement, so you can buy 70,000 head of coverage in a day, or 750,000 head annually. Next slide. Just like cattle, the indemnity is based on if the actual ending value is below the coverage price. For swine, the actual ending value is determined by the AMS price series used to settle the lean hog futures contract at the CME. The weighted average price is calculated using two producer sold data series in the report, the negotiated and the swine or pork market formula categories. Next slide. If you're interested in taking out an LRP or LGM endorsement, the livestock reports page will be extremely helpful. It populates with every offer that's available on a given day, with its terms and premium rate. And then if you purchase an endorsement, you can go back to the page on the day you bought the endorsement after the endorsement is ended and see in the last column where it shows the actual ending value, that will populate and you can quickly see how it compares to your coverage price and if it triggered an indemnity. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Sean for questions.
Sean, if you can unmute your mic.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Cody. Appreciate that. Appreciate the presentation. We're going to move into questions here in a moment. And again, if you have any, you can go ahead and enter those in the Q&A function on the screen there. And we're going to be recording this session as well. So you can access that recording at the conclusion of the event. Just click on that same link that you used to join us today. So we're going to take a few questions now. I'm looking in here into our Q&A to see who is writing to us today. And we do have one here, and I'm going to send this to Cody Lovercamp, who's going to be presenting here in a bit. But Cody, the question is, why does a licensed commodity brokerage firm allowed to sell LRPs along with normal CME contracts at the same time on the same set of steers? Do you have any insight you can offer on that?
Sure. So currently the policy doesn't prohibit a producer from utilizing CME as well as the LRP policy. So because there's no limitation to that, a producer, if they so choose, could participate in CME coverage as well as LRP coverage at the same time. Is there any other questions, Sean?
I think for right now, that's the only question we have in here. I'd encourage folks to please, at any time during this event, you can go ahead and enter a question you have in the Q&A function. But for right now, that appears to be our only question. So perhaps we'll get a few more. Also, another reminder, we've got that email up on your screen there that you're seeing. So if something comes to mind that you'd like some clarification on later, you can write to this email address that we have there, rma.kc.livestock@usda.gov. All right, so with that, I think we can move on to our next. Oh, we have another question. Okay, let's see what we have here. Cody, here's another question that just came in. Can the AIP buy or put to offset the LRPs purchased by agents to offset AIP risk using CME?
That's a good question, one that I may have to follow up on. As far as I know, there is not a limitation that I know of, but again, that's something that's kind of outside of the policy limits there. So that'd be something I'd have to get some additional feedback on from some other folks at RMA, simply because, again, that's outside of really the policy. What we're really trying to cover today is actually what's in the policy. So I'm not sure who asked the question, but we will try to follow up and get a response back to that.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for those questions, folks. Please just enter any question you might have in that Q&A function. And if you wouldn't mind, tell us who you are and where you're tuned in from today. We'd like to recognize you. So with that, we are going to move on to our next topic of discussion. And that is going to be presented by Cody Lovercamp, who's just helped us answer a few questions there. So we're going to move on here. Cody is from Missouri, and he's been with RMA for about 7 years now. He has an ag business degree from the University of Central Missouri, and he's also part of the family farm in West Central Missouri, where he raises corn, soybeans, and beef cattle. So Cody's going to cover livestock gross margin, and he's also going to touch on dairy revenue protection. So Cody, with that, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Sean. So you heard Cody McCann kind of open things up for us a little bit. He kind of gave some background on the livestock programs and why we've seen so many changes to those livestock programs recently. As he mentioned, once that $20 million capacity was removed, that really opened things up as far as what we could do with the livestock programs. LRP and LGM had been around since the early to mid 2000s, and for the most part were heavily underutilized. Now the participation in LRP has kind of increased dramatically, but LGM haven't really seen that big increase like we have under LRP. But we're hoping today, after you all get some more information, maybe this will be a program you all are interested in. I also want to highlight some of the recent changes that we have made. So historically, LGM had been offered only once per month, but here the last couple of years we made changes to where LGM is now offered on a weekly basis. So producers can now come in and purchase LGM once per week. Another thing that changed with LGM is we added subsidy to all three programs. So historically, LGM Dairy had been the only program that had subsidy available. Now LGM Cattle and LGM Swine both have subsidy as well. So again, we've made some big changes to not only LRP, but to LGM as well. So with that, we'll start to get into some of the details of the LGM programs. And to start off with, I just want to highlight some of the consistencies that there are between all three LGM programs. So as the name implies, LGM is a livestock gross margin product. It'll take into consideration the market value of the livestock or the milk minus the feed cost. And so LGM is available for dairy producers, cattle producers, and swine producers. It'll use CME to establish those margins. And then for the indemnity, if the difference is, the indemnity is the difference between the gross margin guarantee and the actual gross margin. So pretty straightforward with that piece of it. One thing that is different with LGM versus LRP is the fact that there are no head limits. So it doesn't matter how big a producer you are, you can utilize LGM and insure all your head. Like I mentioned before, LGM is a weekly offer. So the LGM offers come out every Thursday afternoon and are available until Friday morning the next day. Depending on the program, for cattle and swine, those offers are available until 8:25 a.m. Central Time. And for dairy, it's 9 a.m. Central Time. The reason dairy is different is because we try to make the LGM dairy program as similar to the dairy revenue protection program as possible. So there's certain rules and different things within DRP and LGM dairy that we try to match up to make it more consistent so it doesn't get confusing if you're participating in both those programs, to make sure that it's as consistent as possible, just so, again, so producers don't get confused with the cutoff time with one program versus the other. So the first program we're going to talk about is LGM Cattle. LGM Cattle provides protection against the market value of livestock minus feeder cattle and feed cost. So one of the unique things about the LGM Cattle program is it actually takes into consideration the cost of purchasing feeder cattle and placing those feeder cattle into a feedlot type operation. So for the feed cost part of it, we're only looking at the cost of corn. I realize that a lot of producers use other feedstuffs, but because we have to use some type of proxy price, corn is the easiest proxy price for us to use, and so that's why we use corn to establish the cost of feed. Now, there are deductible ranges from $0 to $150 in $10 increments. So instead of using a coverage level like you see under LRP or DRP, we actually use a deductible. So again, those deductible ranges from $0 to $150 in $10 increments, with subsidy available from 18% to 50%. And the subsidy will depend on which deductible you choose. So the higher the deductible, the difference in the subsidy will be there. For the insurance period, the LGM Cattle program is 11-month rolling insurance period, and you'll see an example when we look at the commodity exchange endorsement. You'll see how those insurance periods roll as the months go on. You'll lose a month on the front end, but you'll gain a month on the back end. So again, we'll be sure to point that out when we look at the commodity exchange endorsement, but do want to point out that that is a rolling 11-month insurance period. So for LGM Cattle, you actually have two types of operations to try and mimic your operation on to establish your gross margin. So you have a yearling finishing operation and a calf finishing operation. It's important to understand the differences there because the different pieces of those margins will impact your overall margin and your coverage. So again, you can set up the LGM Cattle policy to mimic as closely as possible to your own operation, depending on how big those calves are when you're buying them. So when you're looking at a yearling finishing operation and establishing that margin, it's going to assume a beginning weight of 750 pounds, and then it's going to assume a market weight of 12.5 hundredweight. Now, to get that calf from 750 pounds to 12.5 hundredweight, it's going to assume 50 bushels of corn are going to be needed to feed that animal to get it to that 12.5 hundredweight. Now, when you're looking at a calf finishing operation, that beginning weight is going to be assumed to start at 550 pounds, and then a market weight of 11.5 hundredweight. And so you're starting those calves off at a smaller weight, so it's going to take more bushels of corn to get them to that finish weight. And so we're going to assume it's going to take 52 bushels of corn to get them to that finish weight. So a producer is going to select target marketing months in which they actually expect to market cattle. Now, it's important to understand that and to pick months in which you actually intend to market cattle, because at the end of that insurance period, a producer is going to have to submit a marketing report and sales receipts to show that they actually marketed 75% of the cattle they had insured. Now, that's important because that 75% rule that's in the policy is often overlooked. And if a producer overinsures and they don't meet that 75% requirement, their coverage is going to be reduced proportionally, but they're still going to owe the full premium. So it's kind of a back-end penalty to make sure producers are marketing the cattle that they're insuring. And again, that piece of it is overlooked between all three LGM programs and really DRP. And so I'm going to be sure to point that out with all three programs because it is a little bit different, as you'll see, for LGM Dairy. So when I was talking about the commodity exchange endorsement, the commodity exchange endorsement is actually part of the policy. So when you sign up for the program, your crop insurance agent should be providing you a copy of that commodity exchange endorsement. And within this commodity exchange endorsement, you'll see this chart. So in the first column here, you'll see a sales closing month of January and a corresponding insurance period in column 2. When I was talking about a rolling month, 11-month insurance period, you'll see for the sales closing month of January, the insurance period is February to December. But if you look down to February, for the sales closing month of February, you'll see that that insurance period has now changed from February to December to now March to January. So again, you're going to lose a month on the front end, but gain a month on the back end, because again, it's a rolling 11-month insurance period. The other information here, just to give the producer a better idea of how the margins are calculated and what months we're looking at to establish those margins. So again, it'd be great if you could sit down with your crop insurance agent and go through this. They should be doing this. If you're signing up for this coverage with the crop insurance agent, they should be going through all this information with you as producers. For any crop insurance agents that are on the webinar today, I would encourage you, when you do meet with your producers, to make sure and go through all this information with them so that they just have a better understanding of how the program is going to work. All right, so now looking at LGM Dairy. LGM Dairy provides protection for market value of milk minus feed cost. LGM Dairy is going to be a little bit different than cattle, simply because we're not only going to look at the price of corn, but we're also going to look at the price of soybean meal as well. And with that, we actually have some flexibility built in there for the LGM Dairy program, because it will try to allow the producer to take into account the different feed ingredients that they are mixing up in their feed rations for their dairy cattle. Deductible ranges for LGM Dairy range from $0 to $2.10 increments, and then subsidies available from 18% to 50%, again, depending on the deductible that the producer chooses. Similar to LGM cattle, there is an 11-month insurance period. Again, it's a rolling 11-month insurance period. So as you go throughout the crop year, which runs from July 1st to June 30th, that 11-month insurance period will drop a month and then add a month on the back end. So when we're talking about establishing a margin for LGM Dairy, we're going to look at Class 3 milk for the milk price. We're going to utilize the price of corn and soybean meal. And then with that, the producer actually has the ability to go in and adjust their corn and soybean meal ratios based on the feed ingredients that they're actually using on their operation. And so within the commodity exchange endorsement, we have this chart where you can go in and see these suggested conversion rates for different feedstuffs that you use in your dairy ration. So you'll see, like, for instance, if a producer is using corn and cob meal, ear corn, you'll see we have a soybean meal ratio there for that, as well as a corn ratio. So again, you can adjust your margin, your cost of feed, and the amount of corn and soybean meal you're using in that margin based on these conversion rates for different feedstuffs that you're using on your operation. So similar to LGM cattle, again, this is going to seem repetitive, but again, I want to make sure that producers understand this piece of the policy, because this is where producers usually aren't always fully informed of what's going on with the policy, and so they aren't aware that they do have certain marketing requirements at the end of the insurance period. So for LGM Dairy, again, it's important that producers pick target marketing months in which they actually intend to market milk, because at the end of that insurance period, the producer is going to have to submit a marketing report along with milk marketing records. And for dairy, they have to actually verify that they marketed at least 85% of their cumulative marketings for an individual month. So that's different than LGM cattle and swine, and the fact that LGM cattle and swine are a 75% requirement, and for LGM dairy, it's an 85% requirement. So again, just want to make sure producers are aware of those requirements, because it is where producers could potentially have their coverage adjusted and somewhat be penalized if they're not marketing the amount of milk that they have insured. For LGM swine, we take a look at the policy provides protection against market value of swine minus feed cost. LGM swine is a little bit more of a combination of cattle and dairy, in the fact that there are certain pieces of cattle that are that swine is similar to cattle, whereas there's other pieces where swine is more similar to dairy. So one of the pieces where swine is similar to dairy is the fact that for the feed cost, we will take into account the cost of corn and soybean meal. Now, you won't be able to adjust your cost of feed based on the different feed ingredients, but it will still take into account the cost of corn and soybean meal. So the deductible for LGM swine ranges from $0 to $20 in $2 increments, with subsidy ranges from 18% to 50%. And again, that will depend on the deductible that the producer selects. One thing that is different with LGM swine versus the other two programs is the fact that it is a rolling 6-month insurance period. So instead of a 11-month insurance period for LGM swine, it is 6 months, and that's because it takes roughly 6 months from birth to market weight to get those pigs up to that market weight. I realize not every swine operation out there is going to be the exact same, but roughly for the most part, most producers are within that 6-month range of again raising those pigs from birth to slaughter. So the way LGM swine is similar to cattle is the fact that it breaks it down into 3 different types of operations. For LGM cattle, you had 2 different types of operations to kind of select from. For LGM swine, you have 3. You have farrow to finish, feeder pig finishing, and segregated early wean. So you'll notice that for each type of operation, you're looking at a different amount of bushels of corn as well as a different amount of soybean meal. So you'll see for farrow to finish, it's roughly 12 bushels of corn to get that animal from, again, from wean to slaughter, or to get that animal all the way to slaughter weight. And then for feeder pig finishing, it's roughly 9 bushels of corn. And then for segregated early wean, it's about 9.05 bushels of corn. When we look at the soybean meal, again, there's some differences there, but the one thing I want to point out is the way that we have these numbers numerically in the policy. You're probably wondering why we have this 138.55 pounds on the slide divided by 2,000 pounds. That's because in the policy, that's exactly how we have it listed in the policy. So I could have went ahead and done that calculation, but because that's the way we have it in the policy, I didn't want to confuse anybody. So I did leave these numbers just the way we have it in the policy. Again, I would encourage any producer that's interested in these programs to read through these policies and understand how some of these numbers are put together, because there is a lot of math in there. You know, it being close to lunchtime, didn't want to put anybody to sleep today. As you'll see when we get into DRP, we do get a little bit more math there, but for the most part, we're trying to keep this fairly simple and straightforward. But again, the thing to point out here is that we do have different amounts of bushels of corn and soybean meal for each of the types of operations that you have to pick from under LGM swine. The last thing that I wanted to point out here is that for all 3 types of operations, the expected market weight is 260 pounds. So I realize some people are marking hogs at a heavier weight, maybe some at a smaller weight, but for the purpose of this policy, that expected market weight is 260 pounds. So again, similar to dairy and cattle, it's important that a producer understands that they need to pick target marketing months in which they actually intend to market those swine or those pigs. Because at the end of that insurance period, again, they're going to have to provide a marketing report along with actual marketing records that shows they marketed at least 75% of the animals that they had insured for that insurance period. If they don't, again, their coverage is going to be reduced proportionally, and they're still going to owe the full premium. So again, it's important that producers understand that when they're going in and selecting the amount of animals they actually want to insure in each individual month. With that, we'll switch gears and switch to dairy revenue protection. DRP compared to LGM and LRP is the new kid on the block, so to speak, because DRP has only been out there for 3 or 4 years. It is also different in LRP and LGM, and the fact that it came on after that $20 million capacity was removed. So DRP came on, and really we've seen participation just kind of jump through the roof right off the bat. LRP and LGM, you know, like I said before, those programs have been out there in the early to mid 2000s. And so it took quite a while for us, you know, even once we got rid of that $20 million capacity for producers to realize that these programs were out there and really start to take off, as well as expand LRP and LGM to the entire country. DRP came out once it was implemented, and it was offered to the whole country right off the bat. So again, DRP is kind of the exception to the rule as far as the pilot area that we offered right off the bat to the whole country, as well as the level of participation that we've seen. And really, for the most part, we've seen DRP participation be fairly steady. There has been a little bit of a drop recently, but for the most part, it's been pretty steady since the day it was released. So DRP is, just as the name implies, it is an area-based revenue insurance product for dairy producers. So it's going to provide protection against milk price, milk yield, and revenue declines. Similar to the other livestock products, the crop year runs from July 1st to June 30th. But one of the things that is different with DRP is the fact that it is quarterly coverage, meaning it isn't looking at an individual end date like LRP or an individual sales month or individual end month like LGM. It's going to look at a whole quarter. Now, a producer can purchase coverage up to 5 quarters out. So that does enable a producer to lock in coverage over a year out. And just like LRP and LGM, we do use the term endorsement, but for DRP, just want to clarify, it is called a quarterly coverage endorsement because we are looking at a quarter versus a particular end date or end month. Another thing that is unique to DRP is that it does have daily sales, so it's different than LGM in the fact that it is daily sales, but it's also similar to LRP, the fact that we have daily sales, that it's different than LRP because the sales period end time is 9 a.m. So again, when I was going through LGM dairy, I pointed out that we tried to make DRP and LGM dairy as consistent as possible. And one of those places where we try to make it consistent between the two programs is the sales period end time. So both LGM dairy and DRP have a sales period end time of 9 a.m. Central Time. So coverage levels for DRP range from 80 to 95%, with subsidy ranging from 44% to 55%, depending on the coverage level selected. One of the things that is unique to DRP is that we do have what's called a protection factor, and that protection factor kicks in at the end of, towards the end of the coverage. So it allows a producer basically bump up their coverage based on 1 to 1.5, depending on which one they pick. Now, producers need to be aware that, while it does bump up your coverage, it also will impact your premium, so you will have to pay more premium for that as well. Similar to LGM dairy, there is no limitation on the amount of milk that a producer can insure. So a producer, again, has no limitations on the amount of milk. They can insure every pound of milk that they produce on their operation. One of the unique things that we have added to DRP and LGM dairy is that we allow producers to have both policies in the crop year. Prior to us making that change, a producer could only have one or the other. They couldn't have both in the same crop year. So again, one of the recent changes that we made there is to allow producers to have both those policies in the same crop year. Now with that, a producer cannot insure the same months under both programs. So for instance, in the first quarter of 2024, a producer could have coverage under DRP. So they'd have coverage under the first quarter in 2024 under DRP, which is January, February, March. And so they could not have LGM dairy coverage under any of those 3 months. Now they could have LGM dairy coverage under the month of April, but they could not have any LGM dairy coverage under that first quarter set of months. Again, that's just because again, we can't have producers participate in both programs at the same time. That's just the way that we set up the policies to make sure that the same milk isn't being insured more than once. So when we're talking about purchasing this quarterly coverage, this chart is straight out of the DRP handbook. Now, a lot of producers won't necessarily have access to the handbook because typically the crop insurance agents will only hand them the policy and the commodity exchange endorsement. But this chart is in the handbook, and producers have access to the handbook on both the RMA website as well as their crop insurance agent should have a copy of it as well. This chart is just to help give a visual to crop insurance agents and producers if they want to use it, to give an idea of what quarters are available based on where we're at in the crop year. So again, the crop year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So you can see in the first column here that the first time period to select coverage for these first set of quarters is July 1st to September 15th. So within that first time frame, these quarters highlighted in green here would be the quarters available for a producer to purchase during that time frame. Now, as you go throughout the crop year, you'll see that we drop off one quarter and add another quarter. So you'll see 801 will be dropped now for September 16th through December 15th. And so now a producer will have quarters 802 through 806 to purchase coverage in. Again, as you go throughout the crop year, you're going to drop a quarter and add a quarter to the back end. So we do offer two pricing options for producers to pick from under DRP. So it is kind of unique to DRP in the fact that we do offer a lot of options for producers to tailor this program to mimic as close as possible to the milk the producer actually marketing on their operation. So producers can pick from, I think I skipped ahead here, but I think producers can pick from a class price option and a component price option. For the class price option, it's a combination of class 3 and class 4 milk. Class 3 and class 4 can also be broke down into a weight value. So a producer If they're doing more class 3 or more class 4 milk on their dairy operation, they can put a heavier weight value in one or the other. So it can be from 0 to 100%, depending on how the producer wants to set that up. So for this example, a producer set it up, splitting it 50-50. So you can see here, if you take 50% of each of those class 3 and class 4 prices, it will give you your total calculated price per hundredweight. So again, this is how a producer would set this up if they were choosing the class pricing option. So for the component price option, we're looking at butterfat, protein, and milk solids. So for the declared butterfat test, a producer has the ability to adjust that, again, based on what they're actually producing on their operation. So if a producer is selling their milk based on these components, they can set their coverage up based on this component price option. So for declared butterfat test, they have the range to choose from between 3.25 and 5.5 pounds in 0.05 pound increments. For the protein test piece of it, they have a range from 2.75 to 4.5 pounds in 0.05 pound increments. And then at the end of that, again, similar to class 3 and class 4 milk, they can put a heavier weight on one piece of that or the other. And so we'll kind of walk through that here. You can see for the first table here, a producer in this example chose 4.8 and 4.0. So 4.8 for the butterfat and 4.0 for the protein. The other solids is standard at 5.7. So you put that together and that gives you a total value per hundredweight of $20, roughly 57 cents. The next table there is just going to take some of that first information and establish another set of values. So in this third table here, the producer can choose to put a heavier weight in the total value of the butterfat, protein, and other solids, or they can put a heavier value in the total value of butterfat and non-fat solids. So again, a producer can put a heavier value there depending on how they actually market their milk. And it's important for producers to understand that similar to the 85% rule that is there under LGM dairy, that a producer has to market a certain percentage, it's also there for these component pieces as well. So if a producer picks the component price option, they have to be aware that there will also be a check to verify that a producer is marketing their milk based on a component basis and that they are within a certain range of what they're insuring at under the component price option. So for indemnities, let's say a producer has an indemnity on one of their quarterly coverage endorsements. That notice of probable loss will be sent approximately 10 days after the data for the quarter is released. After that, the producer must submit a claim form within 60 days of that notice. Along with that, they must also provide a milk production worksheet and milk marketing record. So similar to LGM dairy, a producer is going to have to verify that they marketed at least 85% of their declared covered milk production. Again, we tried to make certain things between LGM dairy and DRP to be consistent. And one of those things is that they have to market at least 85% under both those programs. Otherwise, their coverage is reduced proportionally and they're still owe full premium. So again, producers need to be aware of that requirement just so when they're selecting the amount of milk to ensure they aren't getting dinged on the backside of that. Now, within the commodity exchange endorsement, you're going to see a lot of information there. Again, that commodity exchange endorsement is part of the policy. So your crop insurance agent should be providing that commodity exchange endorsement to you as a producer when you sign up for the program. So within that, you're going to see a bunch of information such as where to find where the actual milk production is determined. And so for that, you'll see that it is based on the NASP milk production report. And then for the actual prices for class and component options, you're going to see that it's based on the AMS Market Information Branch announcement of class and component prices. But also within there, you're going to see this chart that's here to the right. So depending on what state the producer is in, they could either be in a state that looks at the NASP milk production report for the state, or it could be based on a number of states grouped together in a pooled region. So, for example, if you look at the state of Alabama, you can see that it is part of a regional group. It's in pooled region number 3, which is part of the Southeast pooled region. So for any producer that's in the state of Alabama, when we're looking at your milk production, we're not going to look at the milk production for the state, but we're going to look at the milk production for the entire pooled region. Now, if you look at a state such as Colorado, you're going to see that it's based on a state. So for Colorado, even though it's part of a pooled region, For producers in Colorado, we're not going to look at the information for that pooled region. We're going to look at the information for that particular state, which is Colorado. Again, so this information is in the commodity exchange endorsement. Again, I would highly recommend producers go through this and kind of read through it and ask any questions that they have their crop insurance agent, and really hopefully the crop insurance agents are sitting down with their producers and kind of going through how some of this is put together. So I did provide an example here of the class pricing option. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it is a lot of math, and I know some folks out there have already eaten lunch, so we don't want to put anybody to sleep here. But this example is straight out of the DRP policy, and so if producers want to go through these examples, they can definitely go to the policy and go through these examples. There's also, or these examples are also in the handbook. There's also a component price option example in the policy and handbook as well. So if you're interested in doing that, you can go into the policy and go through those examples line by line at them, because it'll be exactly the way I'm presenting it here. But there are a couple of things I want to point out in this example because, again, you know, DRP does have some different components or different pieces that are unique to DRP versus the other livestock products. And so in this example, you can see it's a producer that's wanting to insure 1 million pounds of milk. They're in the state of Wisconsin. They have a declared share of 100%. The expected milk production per cow for that particular quarter is 6,000 pounds per cow per quarter. They selected a coverage level of 95% and a protection factor of 1.10. Remember, that protection factor ranges from 1 to 1.5, and a producer can pick anywhere within that range. So for this example, the producer picked a protection factor of 1.10. And so for this coverage, or for the 95% coverage level, they have a subsidy rate of 44%. Now, when we look at what the producer selected for the class component, or for the class pricing option, they selected 50% for both. So they're going to look at 50% of the value of class 3 and 50% of the value of class 4. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of the math here because I don't want to put anybody to sleep, and there is a lot to follow through particular example, but the actual milk production per cow increased. And so again, I want to point that out because although the prices dropped in this particular example, the milk yield increased, and so that will offset some of that loss in price there. And so again, another thing I want to point out here is that when looking at the gross indemnity, you're going to see that's where that protection factor comes back into play here on the back end of it. And again, you know, it'd be good to walk through all these mathematical pieces of it with your crop insurance agent to make sure that you and your crop insurance both understand what's occurring here, and as far as tracking what's going on with the math. Because in this example, ultimately, there's a net indemnity of $6,500. And again, this is all in the policy, so I'd encourage you to take a look at the policy. And if you have any questions on the component piece of it, again, there's an example in there for the component pricing option as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sean for questions.
Thanks again, Cody. We appreciate the presentation there. We've had a bunch of questions come in while you were presenting as well, so I want to make sure we try to get to all of the questions that are coming in here today. The first one I have, Cody, is the fed cattle LRP price based on the delivered is based on the FOB, or the DLVD value from the AMS report?
I believe it's the steers FOB. I'll have to go back and look at the policy. I should have had it up in front of me, but I don't have it up in front of me right now. But I believe it's the steers FOB. And I can follow up on that one and make sure that we get the corrected answer in there too.
Sounds good. We had another LRP question here, and that is, can you buy LRP feeder cattle and then keep the cattle and buy LRP fat cattle?
Yes, you can. You know, the intention of the LRP products is to actually buy coverage for when you expect to market those cattle. But let's say you're a producer and you may have bought an LRP feeder cattle endorsement. And then let's say at the end of that feeder cattle endorsement, you're like, you know what, prices are pretty good right now. Feed is cheap. Maybe I'll just continue to retain ownership of those calves and take them to the finishing portion of the operation. You can go ahead and take out an LRP fed cattle endorsement once that LRP feeder cattle endorsement ends. But again, while it's possible, it's not really the true intent of the policy, because again, the intent is to pick coverage when you're expected to market those cattle. But if you do end up retaining ownership, you can go ahead and take out the LRP fed cattle endorsement.
Okay, Cody, another question here. What time in the afternoon do you post the daily offers? That was a question that came in.
It ranges. Typically, we try to have those out there by 3:30 to 4:30 Central Time in the afternoon. Again, some days it might be a little later if we have any IT issues or anything like that. But typically, we have those on the have those offers released by between 3:30 4:30 in the afternoon Central Time.
Okay. All right, another LRP question. What documents are livestock producers required to provide agents? I.e. proof of livestock numbers, proof of ownership, etc.
So it depends on the program. I wasn't sure if that was LRP. For LRP, a producer would have to provide either marketing records or livestock ownership records. If they choose not to market those livestock at the end of the endorsement period, they do have to provide a certification statement, basically certifying that that those animals do meet the market weight that they were insured at, and also have to provide those ownership records. So it's for LRP, it's either ownership records or marketing records. For LGM, it's marketing records. For DRP, also it's marketing records. So again, it's going to depend a little bit on the program, but most of the time, if you have marketing records, those are the best documents that you could provide.
We have a question here from the Lone Star State. Lori's writing in from Texas. Her question is the suspension for the 60 days no longer waived? Is it back to normal?
Yes, it is. Well, it should be pretty close back to normal. So what she's referring to is like the last 2 years, since we've had some really bad drought conditions in different parts of the country, we have actually released a manager's bulletin, essentially release or allowing producers to market their calves before that 60-day requirement under LRP, due to them trying to mitigate any additional costs that they may incur from trying to keep those calves during those drought impacted areas. The way we set those managers bulletins up is that it's based on any cattle or animals insured up to that point. So if you had a 52-week endorsement, I don't remember the exact date of when we did the last manager's bulletin, but I think there's a potential that there are still some calves that would be covered under that manager's bulletin. Again, it depends on any endorsements that you had on or prior to the date in which we released that manager's bulletin.
Okay. All right. Question here. If I purchase cattle on a video sale, can I buy an LRP policy? What if the cattle gets delivered 2 months after the purchase date?
So for video sales, it does get a little tricky. So for video sales in the LRP policy, we make it clear that for the purpose of the LRP policy, you don't have possession of those cattle until you take physical possession. So if you're doing a video sale or buying calves on a video sale, you wouldn't be able to take out LRP coverage until you take physical possession of those calves. And so if you're not taking physical possession of those calves till 2 months later, you would not be able to buy LRP coverage until 2 months later after you do that initial video auction. So again, that is something specific to those video auctions, that you cannot take LRP coverage out until you actually have physical possession of those cattle.
Okay. All right. And we appreciate that question. That came from Danielle Tucker in Fort Worth, Texas, farms in Titus County, Texas, and Holmes and Panola County, Mississippi. Thank you for that question. This one's from Sarah in Oklahoma, Cody. She's asking, are there any restrictions for signing up with RMA and FSA regarding these programs? Any restrictions? It's kind of open there, but I'll leave that to you.
I mean, it could depend on I guess a couple different things, but no, I'm not really aware of anything that would necessarily restrict a producer from signing up from those programs. I wasn't sure if you were referring to participate in FSA programs and RMA programs. There's not really a limitation there. And so if I'm not answering your question, if you could clarify a little bit better, and I'll try to answer your question as best I can.
Okay. I had a question from an agent in Minnesota. They said many finishing weights are 14 CWT or even heavier. Any possibility of 12.5 being increased?
Yeah, there will be some changes coming to LGM cattle for the 2025 crop year. So I'd say if you could stay patient, those changes will be released by April 30th of this year. So there will be some changes coming out for LGM cattle for the upcoming crop year.
Sounds good. We have a few more questions here we'll get to, and then we'll get to the other part of our presentation. We're going to cover pasture, rangeland, and forage, among some other things. This one, Cody, is coming from South Dakota. Amanda writes to us. She says, will LGM ever be expanded to purchase every day instead of only on Thursdays? If not, can you outline the reason?
It potentially would. I can't say that it ever won't. The LGM program, for the most part, we've seen sales increasing pretty steady with going from monthly sales to weekly sales. If we were to go to a daily sale, there would have to be some other adjustments made to the program. So it's not as easy as like LRP or DRP going from, let's say if they had been a weekly offer to a daily offer. If we would go to a daily offer for LGM, there would be some other pieces of the program that would have to change to allow for that. And at this point, those changes haven't been made or haven't been approved by the FCIC board. But those are definitely things that are on our radar as potential ways to improve the LGM programs.
One more here, Cody. This question is, what happens on feeder cattle if they have to move early due to drought before 60 days?
So hopefully, if you're in a drought condition and you purchased a LRP endorsement, hopefully you purchased it prior to that relaxation of the 60-day requirement that would be covered under that manager's bulletin. But if not, let's say you're a producer that purchased an endorsement after we did that. If you have to market your cattle before the 60-day requirement, essentially what happens is you lose your coverage, but are still going to owe the full premium. So again, as Cody McCann pointed out during his presentation, it's really important to understand that 60-day requirement, because if you do market those animals before that 60-day requirement, you're going to lose your coverage and you're still going to owe the premium. So unfortunately, if you're in one of those drought impacted areas and you have to do that, you would lose your coverage and still pay the premium. But I would also say that if you're in one of those drought impacted areas, please let us know. Typically we try to be responsive to producers that are in those impacted areas. And that's why we have done those managers bulletins over the last couple of years to try and help mitigate some of those situations producers are experiencing out there.
Cody, thanks again. We're going to have an opportunity for some more questions here in a moment, but we're going to move on to the last part of our presentation today now. We are going to be talking about pasture, rangeland, and forage, among some other things. I would like to welcome our third presenter. His name is Doug Piney, and he comes to us from Kansas, and he's been with USDA for more than 25 years total. He's been with RMA the last few years here, and he raises cattle, livestock, and also grows some grain crops. Had the pleasure of working with him recently at a conference in Las Vegas, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Doug, to talk about PRF.
Thanks, Sean. I know probably for many of you, you're about to information overload, but we're going to continue on. There are a couple rainfall index products that I'm going to talk about today. These products, as a livestock producer and a grain producer, I understand, and I think the government understands the differences. When I put up hay, I don't haul that hay to town and market it at the time that I put it up, or store it for a while and then sell it. If I have livestock, I'm going to feed it. So these rainfall index products are designed to simplify the process. They're not yield based. It's in theory forage losses due to a lack of normal precipitation. So we'll kind of go through the details of each. The first one that I'm going to talk about is called pasture, rangeland, forage. I think Cody McCann indicated acronyms that So I'm not going to say pasture rangeland forage every time that I go through this presentation. I'm going to refer to it as PRF. So we'll get started. Next slide, Cody. PRF is available in the contiguous 48 states. So this product is available for any livestock producer in the mainland, if you will. We've seen a lot of increased participation in PRF over the last 5 to 7 years. And in 2023, we insured 290 million acres under this product. It's probably one of the biggest product portfolios that RMA has oversight for. Next slide, Cody. Okay, so PRF, we'll go a little bit through a little bit of the basics, and then we'll talk about some policy details. PRF, and in fact, both of these rainfall index products are area-based plan of insurance. So if any of you have livestock and grain crops, typically when you say the word area, you're talking about a geographic boundary, like a county boundary. These products are a little bit different in that these each state or the entire contiguous 48 states have been gridded. These are somewhat pretty consistent in size, but they're just arbitrary grids that are laid out across the U.S. And within that grid, we look at precipitation data. We look at historical precipitation data and compare it to an actual precipitation data received during a 2-month interval. The insurance, like I indicated at the very beginning, it only covers one peril, and that's lack of precipitation. So if you have forage loss for any other reason, it's not going to be covered under this policy. It's just lack of precipitation. PRF, it covers perennial forages with the intended use of grazing or haying. So at the time of acreage reporting, you as a producer, number one, you would decide if you want the coverage, and then number two, you're going to report the acres that you want to insure and declare your intentions for that area. So there are some areas across the U.S. that could be hayed or grazed. So you're designating what your intentions are. If you're grazing that land, remember this policy, the intentions for coverage, you not only have to have an interest in the land, but you also have to have an insurable interest in the livestock that are grazing that land. And then obviously the land must be suitable for grazing. So fences, water source, etc. Are important. Similar with haying, it is on established acres, and that not only you have to state your intentions, that land has to be suitable for the practice of haying. So that is something that, with any insurance products, there's a compliance division that comes out once in a while and looks at things, just make sure that the land is suitable for the practice that you're insuring and declaring on your acreage report. The PRF, it uses a dollar value per acre. So you're actually insuring dollars per acre. And we refer to that as a county-based value. That is by each county. So each state and each county that has PRF policy, you can go and determine what that county-based value is for your county. And it's basically reflective of what the average value of the forage is. Next slide, Cody. So once we've gone over the general premise of PRF, now let's talk about the policy itself. With any insurance policy, there is a sales closing date. So basically what that means for you as a producer, by a certain date, you have to decide if you want to sign up for the particular policy. So for PRF, the sales closing date is December 1st. And at that time, it is also required that you report your acres. So you're reporting your acres, your perennial forage acres that you want coverage on, that you intend to hay and or graze. The policy actually runs through the entire calendar year. So it starts January 1st and ends December 31st. The crop year is divided into 11 2-month intervals. So that when I mentioned about a specific precipitation that happened during a certain interval, this is what I'm referring to. So there's 11 2-month intervals. We have a slide coming up that provides a better visual of that. But you as a producer, you get to choose the intervals that you want coverage on. So the intent of this policy is, when is rainfall most critical to you and your operation, the type of grass that you're haying or grazing, and where you're geographically located. So when is that rainfall most important for you to receive adequate forage growth? So the intervals, you have to select at least 2 of those. You can select more, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. Percent of coverage, so you're actually covering percent value. It's not a percent of yield like grain policies are. It's simply the percent of normal rainfall for that particular grid in that particular interval. Your premium is subsidized for this, just like all other insurance products. The subsidy level ranges from 51 to 59%. So you as a producer, you're paying from 41 to 49% out of pocket for PRF coverage. Now with that, typically, as any policy, as your coverage level goes up, your subsidy level goes down. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your coverage, and that's one of the decisions that you'll get to make if you decide to participate in PRF. Like I mentioned before, it provides coverage on a dollar per acre basis. So for each county, we've set out a county-based value, if you will, that represents the average value of that forage in your county. But you as a producer, you can select a percentage of that value. It's an average value. So you as a producer, you can insure it at 100% of that value. If you think that value is too high and you don't need that many dollars worth of coverage per acre, you can go as low as 60% of that value. If you think that value is set too low and you need higher coverage, you can go as high as 150% of that county-based value. So you as a producer, you're selecting your coverage level of the precipitation, but you're also deciding what coverage that you need as far as dollars per acre for PRF. Next slide, Cody. Okay, I mentioned a few times rainfall index products. So first of all, we'll go into a little more detail. As far as that area, I already mentioned it's a grid, and that grid is 0.25 degrees by 0.25 degrees. So as a livestock producer, what does that mean? So these are arbitrary boxes that's gridded that are about 17 miles by 17 miles square. That varies a little bit based on how close your proximity to the equator, but just understand that it's not a geographical boundary like a county boundary. These are just grids that's plotted across the contiguous 48 states. So within that grid, we're using precipitation data. So where does RMA get that precipitation data? We get it from the weather experts. We're not weather experts at RMA. We look at the experts in the government and also the data set that they offer. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is the agency that we get the data from, and we use the Climate Prediction Center data set. This is weather data. This data set is not just used, and it wasn't created just for this product. It's something that NOAA has had for many years. We're just using that data to drive this insurance product. So where does the precipitation data come from? It's not a magical rain gauge set on your operation. It's NOAA has weather stations. Us at RMA, we're not privy to where all those weather stations are located. They have criteria that they use, but as a producer, understand that it's not a single point system, that they use up to at least 4 weather stations to determine the actual precipitation data, and they compare that to the historical precipitation data for those sites. So it is comparing apples to apples. Understand, if you keep track of your rainfall data, it's not going to match. There may be a weather station within the grid. It may be pretty close to your operation. We don't know that, but it's not going to be a mirror image of the data you collect. It is a multiple point, and it is interpolated, and that the weather stations that are closest to the grid will carry heavier weights, but it's not going to be a one-for-one reading. So what they're doing is comparing the actual, and again, these are for a specific interval and a specific grid, but they're comparing the actual for that 2-month period to the historical data that dates back to 1948. So there's a lot of years. Like I said, NOAA is the experts, and we're just using the data that they are already collecting. And that deviation is always measured on a % of normal, not in inches. Next slide, Cody. Okay, so NOAA, like I said, they're doing this data behind the scenes. It's not for RMA purposes solely. It's used for other things. They collect the data, they compute the grid calculations, they perform quality control processes, and then they finally release the data. There's 3 data types that NOAA releases. There's a historical, real-time, and quality control. Now, RMA, we only use the historical data and the quality control data to drive this program. So we're using the quality control because they've went through there and looked for errors, and we want the most accurate precipitation data that we can to compare back to the historical. A lot of times, many times we get questions of, oh, I seen the real-time data, and how come RMA isn't publishing the results? And so I know if I triggered an indemnity to get my indemnity. And then sometimes the quality control data is different than the real time. And why is that? Like I said, NOAA goes through quality control processes. So many times that quality control data may be a little different than the real time. So we're not holding on to that data to eliminate you from getting an indemnity computed. It's just we have to wait for NOAA to complete those quality control process so we can use the most accurate data. And then once they have published that, then we use that data to compute indemnity payments. And again, we just receive it. We're not making any changes to the data that the weather experts are publishing. Next slide, Cody. Okay, I talked about these 2-month intervals, and I said there's 11 2-month intervals for PRF. So here's you a visual of what those intervals look like. You can see the color scheme there. There's a light green and then some white boxes. So like I mentioned, you got to pick at least 2 of these intervals, but you can select more. You can select the entire calendar year if you want. The only thing with selecting intervals is that you cannot select back-to-back intervals that have an overlapping month. So if you think rainfall in March and April are very critical to you, you can select that interval, but the next interval would have to be the May-June because you can't overlap the month of April. So again, you're deciding as a producer in your area what months are most critical for forage growth. And that's what the intent of this program is for you to go through there and decide which is most critical. And then once you selected the intervals, it does allow you to weight those intervals. And as you can see on the slide, there's a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 60, but it's depending on the grid. And that's all spelled out in the actuarial data that your crop insurance agent can go over with you. So with that, if you selected the entire calendar year and selected every other interval there, you can weight those. Maybe rain's important for you all year round, but you can weight those selections of what's most critical to your area and your operation. Triggering indemnities. As I mentioned, we have to wait until NOAA publishes that quality control data set to compare to the historical. And it's a pretty simple process. It isn't, as a producer, we're not sending loss adjusters out to weigh bales or coming out to your pastures and doing exclusion cage clippings or anything like that. It's strictly based on the weather data and the lack of normal precipitation. So since it is just looks at that, the loss is when the final grid index value is less than your coverage level selected in your area and location. So like I mentioned, you have the flexibility to deviate what coverage level you want. And once you select that, if it falls below, then it triggers an indemnity payment. So an example, and keep in mind, indemnity payments are triggered by grid and by interval. So it's not just a one-time shot. You got to select at least 2 intervals. So there's 2 opportunities, at least 2 opportunities for an indemnity to trigger. But in this example, say you selected the April-May interval and it has an average precipitation of 3 inches and you selected a 70% coverage level. So that means that you want at least 2.1 inches of rain. To receive an indemnity, the final grid value would need to be below that 70% value or less than 2.1 inches of the normal precipitation of 3 inches. Again, that 2.1 inches is not a reading from your rain gauge. It is all NOAA data, interpolated precipitation data that compares the determined actual compared to the historical data. Okay, annual forage is the next rainfall index product. There are some similarities between annual forage and PRF, but there is quite a few differences as well. So we'll go into the details of annual forage. Next slide. Unlike PRF, that's available everywhere, annual forage is only offered in the states on the slide there. So North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. It's available in every county in these states, but it's only available in these states. It is a piloted program, so this is the location of that pilot program. Much like PRF, it is area-based plan, so we use the same gridded system and it utilizes the same precipitation data. So I'm not going to go through those details again, but those grids are the same and the precipitation data for that grid and intervals should be the same as well. You're still insuring against a single peril, which is lack of precipitation. It covers annually planted forages, unlike PRF, that was perennial forages. These are forages that you plant on an annual basis and with the intended use of grazing, haying, possibly green chop, silage. Sometimes you may graze it, then hay it. That's okay. You just got to declare your intentions. Sometimes you graze, then green chop, and that's okay. And then sometimes you graze it. And if it's a small grain crop that you've planted for forage, you may pull the cattle off and harvest that crop for grain. Now, this is a unique to this product, and this is something that is unique. It's not available everywhere within the pilot area. To determine if you're able to have an annual forage policy and then take that on to grain and possibly insure that grain crop under a multi-peril policy, you have to have a short rate for your county. So that is something as a producer you're probably not going to know, but your insurance agent should know that. So if you're interested in getting annual forage coverage on the grazing portion, and then yield protection or revenue protection for the grain portion, make sure and communicate with your insurance agent. I'm not going to go into the details of each, but understand each policy has rules you have to follow. And also your annual forage policy, because you're not utilizing the full benefit of it for a forage crop, then your value dollar per acre is reduced as a result. So annual forage, like I alluded to, it uses a dollar value per acre. It's not the same dollar value per acre as PRF, but it is published for your county. We call it the same thing, county-based value, and we also allow you to decide of that value what coverage that you want. If you want to lower that dollar per acre value down to as low as 60% or go as high as 150%. This policy is the time frames for it is a little different. Like I mentioned, there is a sales closing date for every policy. This one is July 15th. Since annual forages can be planted in the fall as well as the spring, this policy runs from one calendar year. It starts August 1st and crosses over into the next calendar year and ends July 31st. The crop year is divided into 12 growing seasons, and each growing season has corresponding 2-month intervals that you as a producer can select from. With those intervals, depends on the location of the grid and the growing season, but you're going to select 2 or 3 of those intervals. Again, some of that's pivotal on the crop, the growing seasons, and where you're located. It provides coverage as a percent of normal rainfall, the same range of 70 to 90%, same premium subsidy percentages as PRF. And then once again, it has that dollar value per acre that you can choose above or below it. Okay, the growing season, there is 12 of them, and those are basically based on the month of planting. So since the policy runs for 12 months, guess what? There's 12 growing seasons for annual forage. And then each growing season has 6 intervals available for you to choose from. And then the growing season that crop is that you can insure the crop under is dependent on the month in which you actually plant it. The planting dates are basically the first calendar day of the month to the end of the calendar day of the month. So your coverage would start the month following the month of planting. So as an example, and that is also when you need to report your acres. So an example would be if you plant a small grain on August 24th for growing season 1, you have to make sure and report those acres by the 5th day of the following month, which is September 5th. It's very important since for annual forage, you don't have to insure all of your acres. It is very important if you do want coverage that you report timely to your insurance agent. So you're telling your agent by the sales closing date that you want annual forage as a policy, and you're going to select all the possible growing seasons that you may want insurance in, but your coverage is not locked in until you report the acres to your agent, and you can't report your acres until after you've actually planted the crop. So it's very important that you meet that acreage reporting deadline. This is a chart actually from the Rainfall Index Handbook, and like Cody Loverkamp indicated, we've got policies and handbooks that are published. You as a producer, you may or may not want to scroll around our web pages and look for this stuff, but this is a handy chart that if you as a producer want a copy of it, I'm sure your insurance agent can provide it to you. In addition, you can find it in the Rainfall Index Handbook, and that's the reference to it there. So this graph just illustrates that on the planting month that your coverage, when your coverage can begin and what 6-month intervals or what 2-month intervals that are available to you for coverage. So as you can see, an example, if I planted a forage crop in October, my coverage could start as early as November, and then I could select any of those intervals for coverage once I've reported that acreage to my agent. Now, I said there are 12 growing seasons, but not all 12 are available depending on where you're located. As you've seen in the map when we first started, this product rank goes from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border. So there's a little difference in weather. So there have been some decisions that in certain states There are some growing seasons that are not available for coverage. So in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, you cannot receive coverage if you plant an annual forage crop in the month of December or January. And then in the Dakotas, North and South, if you plant in December, January, or February, you wouldn't be able to receive coverage either. Basically, these are months that are probably you're not planting in those months anyway, and it may not be considered an acceptable farming practice to do so. So that's why those were excluded for coverage. Acreage reporting, like I said, it's very important that you don't miss your acreage reporting date if you want coverage. You don't have to insure all of your planted acres of annual forage, but you've got to get it reported timely. And with that, you can't, if you missed that acreage reporting date, you can't go back and insure it later. So if you plant in the month, you can report that acreage to your agent as soon as you pull out of the field if you want. But just know by the end of the month, you've got 5 calendar days into the next month in which you have to report it. So you have the option to choose if you want to insure it or not. But just understand, if you fail to meet an acreage reporting deadline, then you won't be able to have that crop insured for coverage. Next slide. Like I said before, the reason why this policy runs from August to the next July is it accommodates for fall seeded as well as spring seeded crops, and depends on where you're located. Sometimes it's common that you have a fall seeded annual forage crop. Maybe you graze that out in the spring or hay it, and then you turn around and plant another annual forage crop for summer growth and harvest. So can I insure both of those crops if I do? Yes, you can, or the potential is there anyway. So when can I do that? A second annual forage crop can be planted once the last interval of the insured growing season begins. So if you look back to that chart that we had there, it showed you your intervals, 2-month intervals. Once that last interval starts, then you're eligible to plant another crop and possibly insure it if you choose to do so. Keep in mind, the same acreage cannot be planted and insured in a growing season with the same index intervals in the same crop year. And if we go ahead and flip to the next slide, there's a chart that simplifies everything that I just said. Again, this is a chart directly from our handbook. And as a producer, you could receive a copy of this going online or from your agent. So basically, as an example, if I planted the small grain wheat in October and I insured it and I grazed that out, since the last interval of that growing season starts in April, I could plant another crop in April and insure it if I choose to do so. And this is just a written out example of what I just verbally said. So you can read through that at your leisure. Just keep in mind, if I want coverage on that second crop, as well as the first crop, I need to make sure and report it timely and meet that acreage reporting deadline. So as you can tell, both of these products, you as a producer have a lot of decisions. Number one, you're deciding if you want to get the coverage. Do you want to insure the acres? You don't have to insure all of your acres of perennial forage or annual forage. So if you decide to insure it, what grid am I going to select? If it runs across the grid, some pastures are large and they may be right on that grid line. So you may choose, if it's contiguous acreage, you may have a decision of what grid you want to insure it in. Rainfall coverage, what % of normal precipitation do I want coverage on? And how many dollars of protection do I need for my operation? And so that's of that county-based value. Do I want to go below it or above it? Which intervals that are available to me that I want to insure? So what 2-month intervals are most critical to that forage growth, and that not only applies to PRF, but also annual forage. And then of the intervals that I select, as I mentioned, you can weight those intervals. If you can weight it amongst 2 or more intervals if you select, so you can weight those differently. So there's a lot of decisions there that you as a producer will have to make. Your agent can sit down and show you your options, but ultimately you as a producer are going to have to make those decisions. So with that, we have provided some tools, and go ahead, next slide, Cody. There are some tools, and this is just an example of the PRF page on our website. There's a comparable annual forage page, but if you go down to the bottom of it, there is a hyperlink there. It might get small on your screen, but there is a link that you can click on for tools. You can click on it and go ahead and go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. So once you get to the tool page, there's a screen there, and there's actually like 3 different tools within the same page, and there's tabs across the top. The first one is going to locate your grid. So these are arbitrary grids, and they have arbitrary numbers that are assigned to those grids. So what you would need to do is to put the address of your pasture or location or somewhere close to it. There are aerial maps that are underneath as you're doing this. So once you get close to where your pasture or your hay ground is located, you can zoom in and identify where your pasture is actually located and click on a reference point. That will then tell you what the grid ID number is, and that will also provide you the latitude and longitude of that reference point. And that is important. If you're just messing around and playing with this, it may not be that important to know, but it is something. If you decide to take out coverage, that is something that you will need to let your agent know. They can probably assist with helping you figure out what the latitude, longitude of the reference point is for your particular pasture or hayland. It needs to be located somewhere within it, but it can be something that's, you click that reference point. So once that reference point is collected or selected, the next tab over shows you the historical rainfall data for that particular grid. And it is identified by interval. So you as a producer, you can see right there in the tool what the historical rainfall data is for each 2-month interval. So you're not going to know what the future holds for rainfall, but you can look back into prior years. I know we all have years that we identify as livestock producer or farmers that, man, that was a really dry year. So you can go back and you can remember what year it was and about when it was really dry, and you can look at those intervals and you can compare and see if that interval reading or that historical data is reflective of what actually happened in your area. The next tab over, once you have looked at those things, you can use the decision support tool. So all of those decisions, your coverage level, your productivity factor, interval selections, and how you weight them, they do have an impact on what your premium is going to be for the policy, and also have an impact on what the potential indemnity payments would be for your policy. So this tool allows you to make decisions and look at the historical results of what would have happened in the past. It's not going to tell you what's going to happen in the future, but you can look back from years past and seeing, if I made these decisions, this is what this product would have cost me to buy. And then this is also the indemnity payments that would have triggered with these same decisions. So that might help you in looking at the year to come of how you want to set up your policy. And with that, I think we're up for some more questions. So I will turn it over to Sean and Cody Leverkamp to go through any additional questions that have came through. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Doug. Appreciate that. Lots of great information there on PRF, and we've got that email up for you. So if you have any questions, and they might come to you at a later time today or any time really, you can just write to the email that's on the screen there, and our team of experts like Doug will get back to you with those answers. Speaking of questions, here's one, another one on PRF that came in for Cody Lovercamp here. For PRF on hay, can you insure hay meadow if you put the hay up on 50-50 shares? That's a question from Bill in Nebraska.
So for the intended use of haying, you'd have to establish that you have a share. Obviously the landowner would have 100% share until you set up some type of lease agreement or something like that where you establish that there is a share. But yeah, if you are able to establish that you do have a 50% share of that hay and those acres, then you could take out a PRF policy for your share. It's a landowner in that situation would have a 50% share and you would have a 50% share.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that question. I've got another one here. This is coming from Bard. He's asking how much of the grid has to receive precipitation to say that the whole grid got that amount of precipitation. Is it 5 to 10% or a greater level?
So it's really based on the interpolation process that NOAA CPC has established. So there's not always a weather station within a grid. Out in the eastern part of the United States, there's more weather stations, but when you go further out west, there may not be a weather station in every grid. It's really dependent on NOAA CPC's interpolation process. So there, as Doug pointed out, they're going to take a minimum of 4 weather stations and interpolate that data into a particular grid. It's all based on their interpolation process, not necessarily based on a single point of reference like Doug pointed out during his presentation.
Okay, Cody, and he had a follow-up that I think might tie into that, but Bart asked, how do they determine the amount of precipitation when no weather stations are close by?
Yeah, it really is based on the interpolation process, and that interpolation process is just a fancy way of saying there's a mathematical equation that NOAA CPC uses to interpolate surrounding weather station data into a particular grid. The closer to the center of a grid that a weather station is, the heavier weight that has on the average or the interpolation process that they use to pull that precipitation data into a particular grid. But again, there are certain places out there where there's not a weather station directly inside a grid. It's all reliant upon NOAA CPC's interpolation process.
Understood. Lots of great PRF questions here. Here's another one. They are asking, can you expand on land suitability for PRF? I have a BLM lease with lots of acres, but half are salt flats. Can I insure the acres that don't grow anything?
I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with what exactly a salt flat is. I'm guessing, because of the salt, there's probably not a lot of forage growing there. So for the intended use of grazing, those acres do have to be suitable for grazing. So if there is nothing growing there and they're not suitable for grazing, you wouldn't be able to insure those acres. Without putting boots on the ground or seeing it specifically what you're talking about, it's hard to really say yes or no. But I would definitely recommend you working with your crop insurance agent to review those acres. And then if you do insure them, make sure they are suitable for grazing per the policy.
All right, I want to thank Christy for writing in. She has a question. She's asking, if you have a PRF policy on hay ground, can it also be used to cover under a multi-peril policy, or is it one or the other, not both?
It'd be one or the other. You wouldn't be able to have coverage under both, just because that would fall into the part of the policy that says you can't have any other crop insurance program on those exact forage acres. So it could be one or the other. We do get that question from time to time, but it is either one or the other. A lot of producers like to use PRF for non-alfalfa acres, and some people like to use the forage production policy for their alfalfa acres, but they can't have both on the same acres.
All right, sounds good. I had a question come in after that. The question is, will this presentation be recorded? It is being recorded. Just to remind the people watching, you can just click that same link that you used to join us today. A few hours after this, you can access the recording of today's presentation. Cody, I have a question from Brett in North Dakota. He's asking, are there any resources that identify where the precipitation collection sites are located by state?
We don't have really anything published on our website. You can always go to NOAA's website or to other Precipitation National Weather Service websites, and you can find weather stations on there. But I think Doug pointed this out during his presentation. We ourselves don't have a direct list of what weather stations are being used for a particular area. If there's some type of issue, we can always try to get that information from NOAA CPC. But we don't have a place where we publish those weather stations, or really NOAA CPC doesn't have a spot where you can go and look up a certain weather station. Now, there are a couple websites. If you would, please send an email to our rainfall index email that is up on the screen right now. There are a couple of links to 2 different websites that we can send to you. One of them is from Iowa State. That Iowa State website does have some useful information on there. Where you can zoom in on a map and find weather stations. Again, we don't know that those specific weather stations are being used within the data, but we do know some of those stations on that website are used within the data from time to time. It's just we don't know exactly which ones are or are not being used for that data. But it's a useful website that we can send to you if you send us an email.
We have a good question from California here. Dawn writes in about PRF. He asks, does indemnity change if rainfall is just under threshold in a 2-month interval compared to a large deficiency in rainfall for the same period?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, so if you just have let's say you have a 90% coverage level and you're at like 88% of normal precipitation for your 2-month interval insured, your indemnity is going to be smaller for an 88% percent of normal percent of precipitation versus if it had been let's say 40%. So the deeper loss in percent of normal precipitation, the deeper the indemnity will be for that 2-month time period.
Okay. I think you may have touched on this in the presentation, Cody, but here's the question. This comes again from Bart. He says, our closest station is 35 miles away. And if they use 4 to get the weighted average, that means they may be using 1 or 2 that are as much as 100 miles apart. Do they use weather radar data? There are even fewer of them in western South Dakota where I live. Do you know what formulas they use to interpolate the data?
I'm not an expert on their formulas. We simply use the data. So the NOAA CPC data is all public information. Anybody from the public can go and pull the NOAA CPC data just like we do for the use of the rainfall index programs. As far as the distance away from your grid, typically we see out west that could range from anywhere from, if you're lucky to have a station close to the center of your grid, that could be 30 miles. It could be all the way up to, 60 or 70 miles. But again, that interpolation process puts a heavier weighted average on the stations that are closest to your grid. If you want to send in some questions, again, our rainfall index email is up. If you want to send in some questions or a follow-up on that, I'd be glad to elaborate more, or maybe if I didn't answer your question to the point that you would like, please follow up and send an email in, and we can either respond via email or give you a call.
Okay. Latest question I have, this last one in the queue. Of course, if you have one, you can go ahead and send that in. We still have a minute or two to get to any last minute questions you might have out there. Cody, the question is, will there be an opportunity to utilize COCRA's precipitation data rather than limited NOAA data?
Yeah, and I guess this kind of ties back into Bart's question too, and I didn't answer that part. So the NOAA CPC data is purely based on weather station data at this point. It doesn't incorporate any radar data or anything like that. It is purely based on weather station data. As far as COCRA's data goes, I'm not aware of any use of COCRA's data in NOAA CPC data set, but again, RMA doesn't control what NOAA CPC uses within their data set. We just simply pull the data down just like anyone else from the public can. I think the last time we had visited with NOAA CPC about COCRA's data at that point, they were either not using COCRA's data, or if they were, it was a very limited number of COCRA's station reports that they were using. So it's not used on a wide basis, simply because COCRIS, if you're familiar with COCRIS, it is just any individual out there. There's not really any specific training, so to speak. It's just basically a person going out there and reading a weather gauge or a rain gauge out of their backyard. And so there's not a lot of guidance or procedure around that COCRIS data. So it's not used widely within the NOAA CPC data sets.
All right. Okay, we did get another question in here, sliding one in here. It's if a person has a cash leased hay meadow that is grazed part of the year and hayed part of the year, will all of the acres qualify for PRF?
Yes. So if you have a cash lease, if you have a cash lease at that point, the landowner would no longer have an insurable share unless they have that lease set up on some type of percentage of the calf crop or percentage of the hay out there, depending on how you all set that up. I know typically people think cash is just handing over some type of monetary value, but that's not always the case with the way we define a cash lease within the policy. It could be set up to where you're sharing in a percentage of the calf crop or something else that's taking place on those acres. If you're trying to determine whether or not all those acres qualify for PRF, I would say they would, as long as they're being used within the requirements of the policy. If some of the acres are being used for hay and some of them are being used for grazing, you'd have to separate those acres out and ensure some under the intended use of haying and some under the intended use of grazing. If you're using all those acres for both intended uses, we always say that you need to pick the intended use that is most reflective of what the primary use of those acres are. So if your primary use is hay, and then, if you get an extra rain shower or two and you get a little bit of regrowth, then you are able to go out there and graze those that secondary growth with cattle or some other type of livestock, then we would, say that intended use is haying. And just on the opposite side of that, if you're intending to actually graze those acres, but on a good year, you get a lot of extra rainfall, a lot of extra growth, so you're able to hay part of it. But typically in a normal year, you're just grazing those acres. We'd say to ensure those acres under the intended use of grazing.
That all makes sense. Appreciate all the questions we got today. With that, we're going to start wrapping it up here, and I want to just thank you all for tuning in again to the Livestock Roadshow. You can reach out to our presenters, our experts, directly through that email that we've had up on the screen. We're going to get in touch with you if we didn't get to your questions today. Please provide us your email when you write. We're hosting another Livestock Roadshow. There's going to be another webinar coming up. That's the evening of Wednesday, January 17th. That will be at 5 p.m. Hawaii time. I say Hawaii time because we want to reach all of our producers across the country. That'll be 7 p.m. on the Pacific Coast, 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 9 p.m. Central, and again, that's January 17th. We're also going to have several in-person events like this, just in the flesh, and those are going on through March. Maybe in a town near you, you can find those dates, times, and locations. Those are all at our website. That's rma.usda.gov. Just go scroll down on the front page, and we have them all listed there. And with that, I'm going to close down. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I'm Sean Patrick, and have a wonderful afternoon.